What's up, everyone? Back with another episode of Fantasy Football 201. 10 biggest mistakes that fantasy football drafters make. So I will be going through the top 10 mistakes that I see people make in fantasy football drafts. I know a lot of people have already started their drafts, but a lot of drafts are going on over Labor Day weekend. So this video is directed to you if you're still drafting, of mistakes I see people make and how to avoid them. So if you're interested in content like this, please check out my channel. I make a wide variety of videos. I make a lot of fantasy football videos. You can check those out in the description below. I have team previews, strategies for every position, mock drafts, etc. So if you're interested, please check it out. And if you're also interested in other content in my channel too, please consider commenting, or subscribing if you're interested in other stuff as well. So, top 10 drafting mistakes. So I'm going to go in reverse order from the bottom one to number one at the end. But real quick, I want to do two honorable mentions that didn't quite make the list, but are ones that I think are still pretty bad decisions depending on the circumstances. So first honorable mention that I want to talk about is drafting a defense too high. A lot of times defenses get reached for, particularly the Rams or Washington football team, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, things like that, and they cost themselves some other skill position players. However, that can't be justified because some of the defenses, they generally don't go high enough to really make a huge difference, but it's something that I personally advise against. Sometimes it does work out for the people that do take those risks, though. And then the other honorable mention that I want to talk about, too, are drafting multiple players on the same team. I personally try to avoid having two wide receivers on the same team because ultimately one of them is going to have a good game compared to the other one, and then your scores are going to offset if you're playing both. And when I talk multiple players on the same team, I'm talking multiple players that are both starter-level players, not necessarily the handcuff to a running back, which I'm going to talk about in a sec, but guys that are both starting-level positions that one set of outcomes of touchdowns is going to negatively impact the other one. I generally try to avoid those situations if you can. I'm also not talking about a quarterback wide receiver stack. I'm more talking about, like running back and quarterback, because a lot of times if quarterbacks run the ball like Kyler Murray, you're not going to want Chase Edmonds, for example, because they're going to offset each other in terms of their performances from time to time. But yeah, so we will go into the top 10. And our cover athlete for this video, number 10 biggest mistake I see people making in fantasy football drafts this year, drafting Rob Gronkowski. I have talked about this numerous times before, but he should not be drafted at all. He is only going because of his name brand value and his connection with Tom Brady. But if you look at his performances from last year, he was highly inconsistent. Yes, he did play well in the playoffs, but in the regular season, he is going to be taking some games off. He's going to have other games where he has limited involvement because of the just egregious amount of weapons that this team has that they can distribute the ball between. But Gronk, amazingly, is going higher than guys like Tyler Higbee, Hunter Henry, other guys like that are great tight end value that you can get late. So overall, it's just a terrible decision altogether to take Rob Gronkowski. That's why he's on the cover of this video. But yeah, that's number 10. Number 9 biggest mistake I see in fantasy football drafts is not drafting the handcuff to your elite running back you take. So I'm talking the elite running backs that you take at the beginning of fantasy football drafts, like Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley, guys like that. Because if you take a look at last year's running backs, the number 1 and number 2 running backs taken, Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley, both went down with injuries that kept them out for the majority of the season. And if you did not have the handcuffs to them, Mike Davis or Wayne Gallman, although Wayne Gallman wasn't as productive, but if you didn't have the handcuffs to those running backs, then if those players go down, then you're lose all that value. It's not saying that your season's over because you can recover, but if you're drafting somebody like Christian McCaffrey, number 1, for example, you must make sure you have Chuba Hubbard on your team. If you let somebody else take him, then you're putting yourself at the risk that if Christian McCaffrey gets injured, you have no insurance plan for that. Number 8 biggest mistake I see fantasy football drafters making in 2021 is drafting boom or bust receivers. The reason that I say this is because there's some receivers that, Amari Cooper, for example, Jerry Jeudy, for example, guys like that are, their games are heavily dependent on touchdowns, heavily dependent on yards and scoring. But when they don't get receptions and when they don't get enough yardage down the field, their quarterbacks are off. They have a ton of up and down games. So Amari Cooper, for example, you look back at his games, he's consistently in the range of, he'll have one game where he goes off for 100 yards, maybe 2 touchdowns and 8 catches, but then the next game he'll turn around, especially in a game where you're competing for the NFC East title from 2 years ago, where he only has 1 reception for less than 10 yards. So I personally try to avoid players like this altogether. If you want some more specifics on that, you can check out my wide receiver video where I talk about wide receiver strategy. But I try to avoid players that have inconsistent wide receiver performances because you do not want to put yourself in the position where you feel compelled to start somebody like that every single week, but you never know how they're going to actually perform. It's better to take somebody who's got a more consistent floor, who can help carry you in the event they do have an off game, because they do have some games that they are still very productive, even when they're not at their best. Number 7 biggest draft mistake I see people making is drafting guys who are just going to give you modest value. Guys like this are, AJ Green, for example. You already know what he is. You already know he's not going to give you very much. Emmanuel Sanders, another guy like that, whose career is basically done at this point. James Conner, another guy like that. We've seen James Conner pretty much already know who he is. Things like that. Guys like this will not really give you a lot of upside. So there's going to be a caveat to this that I'm going to discuss, but when you're taking players later in drafts with your later picks, you want to make sure that you're taking guys that are going to actually give you potential to break out. If you're drafting veterans late, you can count on them as a floor or somebody that you can throw in the event somebody gets injured. That's not going to win you a fantasy football championship. That's going to win you a week potentially, but if you're trying to win a week, you try to pick up guys like that on waivers. You do not try to be drafting players like that. Try to get yourself in a position where you get guys with a lot of upside, because the ones that do break out will help you win a fantasy football championship. But the caveat to that is the number 6 biggest draft mistake that I see people make in fantasy football drafts, which is reaching too high for players with upside. So examples like this. So you've got a lot of the rookie wide receivers this year's and tight ends. You got Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, Kyle Pitts. They all have, Jamar Chase is another example of this. They all have potential to have very good seasons, but you do not want the hype train to drive it up so much to the point that you're taking these guys like 4th round, 5th round, etc., and costing yourself other guys like Tyler Lockett, players like that in the middle that will give you solid value and have shown consistency in the past. So I bring this up because that's going to happen, is that people are going to feel compelled to reach for somebody like that, or there's a lot of hype going on around Trey Lance of whether or not, he's going to eventually be the starter and then he's going to eventually win week 17 for you, which I think I heard somebody say on the radio. But you can't assume that, because that's the end of the season. So you don't want to be drafting somebody like that at the beginning of the season and taking up a spot for the hypothetical of if they take Jimmy Garoppolo out, etc., because the longer you keep yourself tied to that, the more you cost yourself other players that could be more beneficial to you, that you actually know can be productive to you in the moment. So it's a little bit contradictory to a degree of the upside that I talked about previously, but you don't want to be totally on one spectrum or the other where you're not taking any risk, or you're betting all your money on a guy who's just basically currently on the bench, doesn't have any real outlook to start anytime soon, if that makes sense. So the 5th biggest mistake that I see people making in fantasy football drafts is that they reach too high for their QB. And I've talked about this in depth as well in my QB videos, as well as some of my mock draft videos, etc. But QBs are always taken early because they are the most notable position in football. Everybody knows the quarterbacks of certain teams. And because of that, the hype of that name brand value is going to drive these guys higher than they should be going. There are exceptions if you're in a super flex league that you do want to take some quarterbacks higher than you would in a standard league or a PPR league, for example, with just one quarterback formatting. But if quarterbacks are not being scored anymore heavily than they usually are in terms of their 1 point every 25 yards, 4 points for a touchdown pass, etc., then it doesn't make sense to reach for these players because you're costing yourself when you do something like you take Patrick Mahomes second round, which maybe that's not necessarily a reach, but some other ones that I've seen where the mock draft video where I made recently where somebody took Joe Burrow in the second round, that is a mistake. You do not want to be costing yourself some skill position players at the running back and wide receiver that will be way more beneficial to you than taking a huge risk on a guy that you're hoping will break out, but more than likely won't. So, if you want more information on that, check out my QB video in the description below. The number 4 biggest mistake that I see drafters making in fantasy football in 2021 is that they're drafting multiple tight ends, multiple defenses, or multiple quarterbacks if you're in a one quarterback league. Because these positions should only have one position. You should only be drafting one position for these slots. You should not be drafting 2 quarterbacks that both have good value, and then you can consider switching one or the other because that's what the point of the waiver wire is. You shouldn't, when you take 2 quarterbacks that are good, then you're, like, let's say, for example, you have Patrick Mahomes, and then you're like, oh, well, in case when Patrick Mahomes goes on his bye, I'm also going to draft Tom Brady because then I'll always have that week covered. Because you're now what you've done is that it makes no sense to ever take Patrick Mahomes out because he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And then you have Tom Brady that's taking up a roster spot for somebody that will be more beneficial to you, like a running back who's a handcuff for somebody else who could get injured, or a running back who's up and coming. Guys like that are just way more beneficial to you than holding 2 quarterbacks with value. Unless you're planning to eventually trade them, it just doesn't make sense why you would be drafting players like that when you could just be filling your roster with more flex positions. So the same goes with tight ends and defenses to a degree because ultimately you want to find one that can be valuable, and if it doesn't work out, then just cut bait, try to get one on the trade market, or pick one up on waivers. You should not be drafting multiples of these positions because the most important positions for you to stock up in depth are your running backs and your wide receivers as your secondary one. The number 3 biggest mistake that I see people making, and this goes kind of along with this last point that I made, is that they have less than 4 running backs on their team. Running backs are the most oft injured position in fantasy football, so it is imperative that you have depth at the running back position. If you only go into a season with 4 running backs, or even less than that, then one, you're running a huge risk that your running backs will get hurt, and then you're not going to have backup options. And then 2, the time to get some of these backup options is in the draft. Because once guys are out on waivers, it's a free-for-all of who can take some of these players. And unless you're really savvy in picking up some running backs and getting some luck, you really have to dig yourself out of a big hole if you do not have a stockpile of 5, 6, 7. Sometimes I'll even take 8 running backs on my team. So that way I know that I have backup options in case my starters get injured. And then if everybody's playing well, then you have a huge trade chip because people are going to be desperate for running backs as the season goes along. So not having more than 4 running backs on your team going in, having finished the draft, is one of the biggest mistakes I see people making in fantasy football. And then, okay, this is going to hit home a little bit personally for me because I keep talking about this all the time and people still don't seem to listen. But number 2 biggest mistake that I see fantasy football drafters making is that they take a kicker higher than the last round. I have talked about this numerous times. I have a whole video devoted to kickers, and yet I see people drafting Justin Tucker in the 8th round. He was the number 8 kicker last year. He was not that good. Guys that you could have gotten on waivers were better than Justin Tucker. and there's guys that were better than him that were available in the last round. So it just doesn't make any sense to draft a kicker. If you want more in-depth analysis on that, go to my kicker video in the description below. But it's easily one of the biggest mistakes you can make by taking a kicker higher than the last round because it's just simply not needed. And then I'm kind of surprised this even is a spot for this number one decision, but I still see people doing it. And the number one biggest mistake that I see people making in fantasy football drafts is that they draft multiple kickers. They do not do anything for you. So it's bad enough that you're taking a kicker high, but I have seen people, and I'm not lying, they'll draft Justin Tucker all the way up in the 9th, 10th round, for example. And then they'll get later in the draft, and they're like, oh, I've already got a good amount of running backs and wide receivers. I even got 2 tight ends, so now I'm going to take another kicker. Why does that help you at all? Kickers do not do anything for you. If you go through my video, I explain very thoroughly how kicker stats are all relatively equal to each other, and the difference between the number 1 kicker over the last 3 years and number 20 kicker over the last 3 years is 3.2 points per game. So why would you have another kicker on your roster? I have literally seen somebody with 3 kickers on their team. I do not know why he did that, but it happened. So my point is, that is the biggest mistake I see people making, is having more than 1 kicker on their team. So yeah. All right, well, rant aside, that is my top 10 biggest draft mistakes I see people making in fantasy football drafts. Let me know what you think are the biggest mistakes that you see, and let me know what kind of questions or any comments or whatever that you'd like to have regarding some of this if you're a little confused with some of the stuff I was saying. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and once again, if you're interested in more stuff like this, please consider commenting, or subscribing to the channel. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.